While I love all the topics of biology, hence the reason why I teach it, my ultimate favorite is genetics and heredity, and that's the unit that we're in right now. One of the first people credited to genetics is Gregor Mendel. In the 1800s, he was a monk, and he studied pea plants. Probably not too exciting, but when you're a monk, what else do you really have to do? He noticed that the pea plants had many different characteristics and tried to come up with an explanation of how they got passed on. This is not in your note sheet, don't worry about writing it, just listen. He was noticing that flowers differed in color, the position of the flowers at the middle of the stem versus the top. He noticed that there were differences in seed color, shape, the pod color, shape, and so he continued to do experiments on peas. This worked really well because peas reproduce quickly, so he was able to track many traits over many generations. And what he noticed was that they didn't really do what people expected them to do. Back in the day, people believed in something called the blending theory of inheritance. And kind of summarized by this comic here, the blending theory of inheritance meant that if you mixed a tall plant with a short plant, you should blend those traits and you should end up with a medium plant. But he noticed that that really didn't happen. Another example would be if you crossed a red plant with a white plant, you should end up with pink. Well, that didn't happen every time. So his studies really were the foundation that led us to figure out how genetics work. We need to have some vocabulary background in order to understand genetics better. First, genetics is simply the study of heredity. And then that may lead you to ask, well, what exactly is heredity? That's passing characteristics from parents down to their offspring. When we're looking at these characteristics that get passed on, the gene, we learned about this in the last unit, is the small segment of DNA that physically gets passed on through mitosis and meiosis into daughter cells. Remember that genes are located on chromosomes. You get one copy of a gene from your mom and one copy from your dad. So let's say that this is for the ability to roll your tongue. Can you roll your tongue? You know, if you stick out your tongue, can you roll it so it makes that U shape? If you can. Or if you can't, that's a genetic trait, and we'll talk about that later, where both your mom and dad contributed to your ability, or your ability not to, be able to roll your tongue. The trait, then, is the characteristic that is coded for. So the gene is the physical piece of DNA. The trait in this case would be being able to roll your tongue. Now, this is not on your note sheet, but it is a very important term, so please, off to the side, somewhere by genetics, heredity, genes, and traits, I need you to add in a word, allele. Each copy from your parents is called an allele. Think of it as an option. If we assign a letter to it, the letter T for tongue rolling, you get one allele from your mom, you get one allele from your dad. Together they code for if you can roll your tongue or not, or whatever trait we're looking at. When we look at traits, what we physically see or know is called the phenotype. And physical and phenotype both start with the letter P, and that's how I remember it. For example, the phenotype would be if you can roll your tongue or not. Another phenotype is, are you left or are you right-handed? A phenotype, tall or short, red hair, not red hair, etc. If we actually looked at your genes, the genetic part, that's your genotype. Geno starts with G like genetic, it also sounds like the word G. If we looked at what was coded for, we'd be using letters, and we're going to come up on that next. Big T, big T, big T, little t, little t, little t. Big L, big L, big L, little l, etc. The genotype are the genes, the phenotype is the physical aspect of that trait. When we look at passing traits on, we can look at generations. The P generation is the parent generation, so over here we have two different pea plants, a round versus a wrinkled seed. If you cross them or mate them, you end up with the F1 generation, the first filial, which from mating the two parents, you end up with the F1 generation. This we could sub in, let's say your parents, your mom, your dad would be the P generation. You, and if you have siblings, are part of the F1 generation. Now someday when you get married and have kids, if you get married and have kids, you will be contributing to the next generation, which would be the F2 generation, the second filial generation, and we could keep going on, F3, F4, etc. But most things that we're going to look at will not go beyond F2. Since we always have two parents mating, male and female, how many copies of each trait do you get? You always get two. So for being able to roll your tongue, you get one copy of that trait from your mom, one copy of that from your dad. We use letters to represent the traits. If it is a dominant trait, we're going to use a capital letter. If you're feeling confused right now, don't panic. This is going to make more sense after we do some examples and work with this. So just trust me and listen for now. A dominant trait we represent with a capital letter. I'm just picking H. So for a dominant trait, let's say it's capital H. If you have two alleles, here we have big H, little h, if you have a capital letter, that trait will always be shown. Let's say that this is being hairy, because H for hairy. Okay, if you have a dominant, and let's say hairiness is dominant, if you have a big H, a dominant letter, you are going to be hairy. Even though this is a little h over here, the big H is dominant and it will show up. A recessive allele is shown with a lowercase letter such as little h. In this case, little h means not hairy. If you had big H, you'd be hairy. If you had big H, you'd be hairy because it is a capital letter. But if you had little h, you would not be hairy because both traits are recessive. This goes into using letters to represent what's going on. Here are different options. We can have letters that are homozygous dominant. Homo means same. Remember a homosexual person is attracted to somebody that's the same gender. So homozygous, same. Dominant means capital. If a trait coded in somebody is homozygous dominant, you have two big letters. So big H, big T, big R, big R, etc. The letter usually has to do with the trait. So like I said before, let's say H is for hairy, T is for tongue roller. If you're homozygous dominant, you have two of the same size letters. Heterozygous has one of each letter, big H, big T, big R. The capital letter is always going to show up first. That's how you write it. In this case, the person has, if you look at the chromosomes here, heterozygous alleles, big H, or whatever letter we're looking at. If H is for hairy, this person is hairy because the dominant letter is present and will be expressed. Homozygous recessive, homo, same, recessive, little letter. This is somebody that would have two little letters for whatever trait we're looking at. For example, little h. The recessive trait is expressed because it's not hidden by a big letter. This would be being not hairy, or not being able to roll your tongue, etc. When doing problems, you need to be very careful with letters that look alike when you write them. So some people write a big C and a little c exactly the same. So you should come up with a way to help show the difference. Either write like the capital letter in print and then the lowercase letter in cursive, like a cursive S is very different from a printed S. Or underline your lowercase letters so it can be a little more clear. So what you're going to do is you're going to put these things into practice. You need to look at the variety of traits on the next page, see if you have them or not, decide your phenotype and your genotype. I'm going to show you two examples with mine. Yours might be different, so don't copy down exactly what I write. Can you roll your tongue? Can you do this with your tongue? I can. Being able to roll your tongue is dominant, and not being able to is recessive. So my phenotype, physically what you see, I can roll my tongue. If you cannot, you're going to put that you cannot roll your tongue here. Possible genotypes. What could my genes look like? Because this is a dominant trait, there's actually two options. I could be big T, because big T, having just one of them means I can roll my tongue. Big T, or I could be big T, little t. Capital letter first. I don't know which one it is, so I have to put both. Okay, if you quickly clasp your hands, which thumb ends up on top? For me, my right thumb ends up on top. Having a left thumb on top is dominant, but having your right is recessive. Now, why don't we use an R here? Because you always label it for the dominant trait. Because this is recessive, my genotype has to be little l. There's only one option. If I was big L, little l, my left thumb would be on top. And I know this kind of looks like a U, but I swear, those are two little L's. Do that for the rest of them, and if you get stuck, ask for help. You might have to have somebody kind of look for you or use the mirrors in my room, and then conference with me to see if you got them right, and then you're going to do a worksheet looking at even more traits.